Welcome back, everybody. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. And again, for the new arrivals, because we're doing other baking other than just the class stuff today, I'm just finishing up some kneading of some bagel dough that I was working on between the sessions. So this is what a really dry bunch of dough can look like after it's been kneaded for a while. Some of you may want your bread dough to be this dry and stiff. The dough I'm going to be kneading for this next session to be setting up for bread, you're going to see is a lot wetter than this. And you can do everything in between. This is about as dry a bread dough as you would want to have. And as you'll notice with the dough, as we're kneading it, it just gets silkier and smoother. As those gluten strands start to weave together, it gets smoother and silkier. So, but I'm just going to keep kneading this until everybody else shows up. And then I'll get out my bread dough. Again, we're going to be forming this into bagels. And because we have to drop it into boiling water and handle it a lot, I like to have a drier, stiffer dough for making bagels. But the entire process we've been through with this dough is exactly like we've done for the breads. We've just had a slightly higher flour to water ratio for this bagel dough. And that's the fun thing about learning sourdough is you can just constantly play with and adjust. And again, don't let any of the recipes out there tell you that you have to have it exactly just so. I'm convinced that a lot of people stay away from sourdough because all these so-called experts tell everybody how difficult and hard it is and how delicate and touchy it is. And all that does is keep people from trying it. When in fact, if you just get your hands in the dough and experiment and play, you can come up with your own results and your own methods that work for your own environment in your own house. Because as we said in the first session, the humidity in your house, the fauna of your house, like every house has got different bacteria in it. With the kind of housekeeping you do, whether your house is super clean or a little bit on the messy side, is going to change the bacteria and the yeast that's present in your house. And when you make sourdough bread, you're literally harvesting that yeast and bacteria to put in the bread instead of buying commercial yeast and bacteria. So nobody on the internet can tell you exactly what you need to do in your house to make your bread. All right, so this is now a lovely bunch of bagel dough. I'm just going to set aside, and we're going to get started with our bread dough. But before we get started with our bread dough, I want to just say we had a really great question that came in by a text after the first session. And it's such a good question. It brings up so many interesting topics. And whoever the student was, I don't know who you were, I didn't see your name in the text, but whoever the student was had a challenge that they overcame, and it's such a perfect solution, and it shows you how flexible the whole sourdough process can be. They texted us saying that they had left their leaven that they made last night on the stove, and it accidentally got cooked. So they got up this morning and they had no leaven. Their leaven was cooked. But they got creative and they said, well, they just instead used a bunch of their starter as the leaven. Will that work? And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. If you think about what we did to make the leaven, it's really just another kind of starter. So if for any reason your leaven goes bad, you ruin your leaven, it really is just another batch of starter. You know, the ingredients are the same. It's water, dechlorinated water, and flour. That's it. And so in a pinch, you know, and if you, the other thing that's great about that is if you decide you want to bake bread someday and you haven't prepared and made your leaven the night before, but you've got a nice batch of sourdough starter in the fridge, you can literally just pull out a bunch of starter and just take a bunch of starter and use that for your leaven. The leaven is just yeast and bacteria that you're weaving into the dough in order to get it to rise. And the starter, of course, is that. So we're good to go. So before we start, I want to go back to what I was doing when some of you came in, and that is making this, as you can see, fairly dry, fairly structured ball of bagel dough. As you can see, it's got a lot of structure to it. It's easy to handle. It's not sticky. This can make a nice sourdough bread. Sometimes when we make sourdough bread, we'll have a dough that is this dry. So if your dough is this dry, don't worry about it. It'll be a lot easier for you to work with. It'll be a lot easier to handle. You'll still get a nice rise out of it, and you'll have delicious bread. We like to make it dry like this for bagels because, again, we're going to put it in water, and a wet dough can get really downright slimy and sticky if the dough is too wet. On the other end of that spectrum, I'm going to show you, this is the dough I'm going to knead now, and you can see it's like practically pouring out of this bowl. I mean, look at that. It's just wet. It's a big, wet, glumpy mess. And to this, I'm about to add more water. So this is going to get even wetter. So if you've got anything in between, you're good to go. So again, this whole notion that it has to be exactly a specific way, it's not true. You know, it's just not true. You were going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to kind of set up this next segment.
Perfect.
So what we're doing is we're going to take the dough that we prepared earlier, and we're going to knead the dough. We're going to add our salt water to it, and then we're also going to add whatever spices. In our case, in our kitchen, we have our thyme, or I'm sorry, our rosemary that we're going to add to the bread. And so when all is said and done in this segment, we're going to have our dough nicely kneaded and then ready to go into a proofing basket where it's going to sit and rise for a couple of hours. So that's kind of where we're at in this segment. And I always like to think of the kneading part of this process as getting your upper body workout, because you are going to be putting some muscle into this to really work the dough.
And again, when you look at the recipes online, people will try to say you need to knead your dough for 5 minutes, or you need to knead your dough for 10 minutes. And again, they're all lying. How long you need to knead the dough is up to the dough. It's up to your hands. It's up to the room that you're in. We're going to try to give you some tips so that you can feel the dough and understand what's happening. I like to describe it as you're kneading, you're going to reach a point of the kneading where all of a sudden the texture of the dough is going to change. And you're going to feel for that change in texture. It's going to suddenly become silkier, smoother, and more rubbery. And when that happens, that's about the time you're done kneading. You can knead it just a little bit more to get that's the formation of the gluten. When those strands start to weave together, it'll start to get really nice and slippery, smooth, and silky. And that's when you're pretty much done with the kneading process.
Yep, by comparison, I just wanted to show you this one. This is kind of an in-between. It's not as firm as the bagel dough by any means, but it's not as watery as the one that Mike is going to be using for bread. I'm going to be in the background here kneading this, and what I'm going to be doing with this is setting this up on a baking tray, a cookie tray, into our rolls. The rolls are basically the same as the bread. It's just you cut it up into small balls of dough.
Yeah.
That becomes the bread.
Very good. And so because this is so wet, and because the very first thing we're all going to do is, remember we started with 1.5 cups of dechlorinated water, and we're going for about 75% hydration, which means we actually need to add another 1/4 cup of water. So the very first thing we're going to do is take a 1/4 cup of water, and we're going to dissolve 1 tablespoon of salt into that water. And I've done that already. Again, adding salt to the first dough can cause the gluten to not form well, and it can inhibit the hydration of the flour. So we don't add the salt right away. We add it at this stage. And because my dough is already so wet and sticky, and I just want you guys to see something here. You can see all the air bubbles that are already starting to form in this dough. It's already starting to rise and get bubbly. That's wonderful. We've got a really active bunch of dough here. But I'm about to add a bunch of water to this already very wet, sticky mess. And so to compensate for that, I'm just going to take a little handful of flour and I'm going to sprinkle it on the top so that my hands don't stick to it. And I'm going to put this 1/4 cup of water with 1 tablespoon of salt into that mix. And I'm just going to start mixing that all together. And just kind of get that water and salt kind of blended through this dough. And again, this is a super, super wet dough. I'm going to absolutely have to flour my surface. Depending upon how wet your dough is before you knead it, will depend how much flour you want to put out on your cutting board here or whatever surface you're rolling your dough on. This is very, very wet, so I'm going to very heavily flour my kneading surface here. And I'm just going to kind of generally work that flour and water and stuff into this dough. This is a very, oh gosh, this is going to be an interesting dough to work with. It's, I wish you could feel this dough. It feels really puffy. It feels like a saggy water balloon. It really has got a lot of character to it. Don't know how that ended up that way, but this is going to be a fun loaf of bread. So anyway, you can see it's very, very wet. We're just going to then take, once you get the water and the salt kind of worked through the dough, we're just going to plop it out on the counter on your surface that's been floured. And you're going to, again, decide how much extra flour you want to work into it. And the technique that you decide to use to knead your dough is entirely up to you. When you've got a wet, sticky mess like this, if you've decided that you want to use a wetter dough, you'll see the professional sourdough folks will use these bread scrapers. You can use your hands. You can also use just a big, giant knife. There are things, anything that you can move the dough with, that the dough is less likely to stick to than your hands. And you just kind of work it around and you're going to come up with your own technique. You're going to fold, you're going to push, you're going to pry, you're going to just work that dough. And if you've got a really wet dough and you're wanting to make it drier, you just continually tuck in and rub a little bit of extra flour in, and you push and pull and just go at it. It's now about 9:40 or so, and we're going to probably do this anywhere in the range from 5 to 10 minutes. And you're going to pay attention to your dough when it starts to get really silky and smooth. And you're going to feel kind of a rubberiness to it, hopefully. That's when your dough is going to be done. And you can just stop kneading. If I get mine done, if mine finishes up before yours, I'll stop and wait for everybody to catch up. You want to find a point where when the dough stops getting so sticky and it becomes really smooth and silky, and you're gonna, there's a process too that they sometimes call window painting. If you spread the dough apart now, you can see it kind of breaks up and it doesn't stick together nicely. So that's not a well-formed dough. As the dough forms and the gluten strands connect together, when you pull it apart like that, it will hold together and you'll get this nice, smooth stretchiness to the dough. You want to feel and find that nice, smooth stretchiness in the dough, and that's how you know it's pretty much done. And again, if you've got a wet dough like this one, a dough scraper like this can be really handy because it doesn't tend to stick to the scrapers like your hands so much. So anyway, as we're folding and kneading our dough, I just wanted to talk to you a little about wheat and how we're growing wheat and why I think we are having problems with people eating wheat. I mean, for tens of thousands of years at least, humans survived largely on wheat, and all of a sudden in very recent times, people have stopped being able to eat it. And I suspect, and a growing number of people suspect, that it has all to do with how we're growing our wheat and what we're doing in the bread making process. And the key things that I think are the problems there are most all of the wheat in the United States now is genetically modified. It's Roundup ready, meaning that they prepare the soil by dousing it with large quantities of Roundup herbicide, which is very toxic. Some of the side effects that we know and that are documented by science from Roundup are all kinds of gastrointestinal problems. Roundup actually causes lesions in your intestines. And then about 10 years ago, the manufacturers of Roundup decided that they would convince the large agribusiness growers of wheat that Roundup is also a great desiccant. It dries plants out. So they decided it would be really great to start spraying the Roundup ready genetically modified wheat with Roundup after it was ripe. So they use it after it's ripe to spray on this. So they spray the ripe wheat with this toxic product that destroys our intestines.
Can I interrupt you and ask a question?
Sure.
I'm a bit lost here and getting just different advice from folks on the chat. How much salt and how much water should we have added before doing this knead?
A quarter cup of water and a tablespoon of salt.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. So anyway, then we wonder why people are all of a sudden having a hard time eating wheat. In my experience, as somebody who used to have trouble eating bread and pasta and stuff, I think it's all because of that. When I switched over to eating nothing but organic wheat, my ability to eat wheat got a lot better. When I switched over to sourdough, all of my issues with eating wheat disappeared. And I think that's what it's really kind of all about. So I'm not sure how much you can tell from looking at this, but the consistency of the dough here has changed really dramatically already. It's not sticking to my hands. It's barely sticking to the cutting board at all. And it's turning into this really silky, smooth, lovely bunch of dough. And now when I start to window pane, it doesn't pull apart so much. It kind of stays sticking together. It doesn't break apart so much. So my dough is getting close to being done. Not quite done, but it's getting close.
Mine too.
And I love to see, you guys, you have no idea how much fun it is for me to see all your hands working your dough.
Yep. So basically at this point, we started with 11. To it, we added 4 cups of flour. And in total, we've added 1 3/4 cup of water. We did the 1 1/2. We added the 1/4 to it with the salt. So that's the 3 ingredients so far that have gone into this mixture. I've added my rosemary into the dough and kneaded it some more so that the rosemary mixed into the bread evenly throughout.
Now you'll be able to see, I just pushed this dough out flat onto the cutting board. You can see the consistency and texture of this dough is dramatically different than when I started. And now I'm going to take some of this rosemary that I had. I took the leaves off of the fresh cut plants before we started. And I'm just going to sprinkle it into the dough at this stage. Then I'm just going to roll this back up using my dough scraper to get it off the cutting board. And then I'm just going to keep kneading to get that rosemary worked all the way through. And if you have any spices, make sure you get it in and worked through your dough. And then when you get the texture right and you feel like you've got the gluten set, the next stage we're going to do is called shaping. And the shaping of the dough is one of the most important parts. And for me, it's one of the funnest parts. It's when your dough ball really, really comes together. Now wow, there's some beautiful doughs. I can see some really lovely doughs. I can see Joan's really well, and that dough looks amazing, Joan. Rick, yours looks great. I can't see everybody, so if I don't say your dough looks great, it might be because I can't see it. But wow, there's, yeah, beautiful silky looking doughs. And again, you want to be careful not to over knead your dough. Once it gets to that really nice, smooth, silky stage, you kind of want to stop. And I'm just gonna, I think my dough is about ready here. I'm just gonna knead it a little bit more, and then I'll wait till everybody thinks their dough is done. I can see, and actually Betsy, even though it's farther away, it looks like your dough is moving really nicely. Sarah, it looks like you've got some beautiful dough. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Okay, now you'll notice with my dough now, it was really kind of wet and lifeless. I don't know if you can see this, but when I push it down now, it kind of rises up itself, and it's like it's trying to form its own round ball. It's that the gluten is really pretty well established in this dough. So I'm just going to stop kneading mine and wait till everybody sort of catches up.
I am also stopping mine.
Rick and Joan, your dough looks lovely, beautiful, nice round balls. Kim, yours looks lovely. Diane, that looks good too. Excellent. Just wait just another minute or two. And see this, what was this really wet, goopy mess? This is still a lot wetter than this bagel dough. It's much softer, but the stickiness has pretty much come completely out of this.
And I'm kind of showing mine up here to the to the camera. I have taken my dough and made it into a long cylindrical tube because I'm preparing rolls. So I need to cut them apart. And so I have shaped mine into this, long baguette kind of shape.
Okay, so now when we get to the next phase here, we want to have our proofing basket ready. And again, I'm going to be using one of these professional Bratz proofing baskets. I cannot recommend these highly enough. They're just wonderful proofing baskets. They're very inexpensive. They come with these removable cloths, and you can proof your bread with or without the cloth. If you put the cloth in and you proof them with the cloth in the basket, you'll have a nice smooth surface on the surface of the bread. If you do it without, the markings of this textured basket will actually get embedded in the top of your bread for a really decorative look. Because of other things that we do with our decorating, we do the smooth version, so we keep the cloth in the basket. And again, if you don't have a proofing basket, you're going to want to have something aside, like we like to use a colander with a cloth. If it's the first time you've proofed bread on a cloth, you're going to need to take a lot of flour, and you're going to drizzle it all around in that cloth, and you're going to take your fingers and work that flour into the cloth. If you don't have enough flour in the cloth, the bread dough is going to stick to the cloth and you're going to have a mess. So you need to use a lot of flour, and then you're going to use the same cloth over and over. So don't ever wash this cloth. Dried flour is, shelf stable. So you just keep the cloth with the flour in it and use it over and over and over. We've used this proofing basket a lot, so I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of flour in my proofing basket, move the flour around. Because I like pretty bread, I'm all about prettiness. I'm going to take some of these beautiful rosemary leaves and I'm just going to sprinkle them around the proofing basket. What is in the bottom of the proofing basket is going to end up being the top of your bread. So if there's anything else that you want to decorate the top of your bread with, you can sprinkle it in the proofing basket. Some people just like to put extra flour in, so you get splotches of beautiful flowers dusted on the top of your bread. And so once your proofing basket is set and prepared, we're going to shape our bread. But since people are still kneading, I'll wait and let you catch up. Oh, this is going to be lovely dough. Oh my gosh, this is just beautiful. And in the shaping process, what we're going to try to do is form a tight skin. We're going to try to make the outside of the bread, because this is pretty saggy stuff. And we want it to have as much shape and texture and structure as we possibly can. And one of the best places for that structure to be is in the outer skin, what's going to become the crust of the bread. And there's a very specific technique for how you can do that. Earlier, I described what we're creating ultimately as like a tight water balloon. And the technique that we're going to use for doing that, you can take, again, either a bread scraper like this, or you can take a big, thick, heavy knife like this, or you can just, even use your hand like this. And in either case, whatever you're using, you're going to take the scraper and use it to slide your bread toward you. It's going to start stretching the skin, the outer skin of the bread on this one side. You're going to pick it up, flop it over the other way, and then do the same thing. Quarter turn, and just keep doing that. As you do that, the outer skin of the dough is going to get tighter and tighter and tighter. And as it gets tighter, as that tension forms, it's going to get less sticky. And ultimately, what you want to see is a nice, smooth, tight skin on the outside of that bread ball. And it's really just as simple as a scrape the bread toward you, quarter turn, scrape the bread toward you, quarter turn. And you can see with every time I do that, that skin gets smoother and tighter. What started out as a fairly rough and bumpy surface is now like as smooth as butter. So you want to have this nice, tight texture to that bread. Beautiful. Nice job, everybody. And I'm just going to hold this bread ball up. Look at what a nice, smooth loaf of bread that is. Then we're going to take that smooth side down, flip it upside down, and drop it into our proofing basket. And again, it's the bottom of the basket is the top of the bread. Beautiful, nice job. Oh, beautiful. Rick, gorgeous. Yours looks a little bumpy, Rick. Keep scraping. I want to see that nice smooth ball. Nice smooth ball. You should feel a stretch on the front. The front of the dough should be kind of gripping the cutting board, and that's what's causing the tension. That's what's causing it to move.
Do you think this is too bumpy still?
I think from here it looks beautiful, Gretchen. It looks gorgeous.
Just checking.
It looks like can you feel that, does it feel like a tight skin on the outside? It should feel like there's some tension in the outer skin.
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah, beautiful. Then that's what you're looking for. If it feels like there's texture or tension in the outer skin, you are all set. And while you guys do that, this is my bread. Oh, beautiful, George.
Just to show you the rolls, I have done the very same thing you're doing with your bread. It's just now I have 10, little baby loaves of bread, and they're on a cookie sheet with flour on the bottom so that when they cook, they don't stick.
And we do that same scraping activity with each of those little balls to get the tension in the dough. And then while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and make up 8 bagel balls, 8 bagels with this much drier dough. And the way I split the dough is I just take my scraper and I slice it in half, and I do that until I slice each thing in half until I have 8 similarly sized balls, and then I will have 8 bagels out of that one round bunch of bread. And then I'm just going to form these into nice tight little balls. I use a slightly different technique for the bagels. This is going to be a beautiful bagel dough. And then for those interested in making bagels, after you've made your nice, smooth, even ball, you just push your thumbs through. And voila, a bagel. And the bagels, because they get wet later, I like to make sure there's extra flour. So I dip the bottoms in flour and put them on our cookie sheet. Joan, that bread looks beautiful. Rick, nice. That looks like, Rick, it looks like yours is getting smoother. Are you feeling that it's smoother?
Is it the bottom part that's supposed to be getting smoother, or the top part?
The whole outside. As you scrape it, it should be coming together more. And as you pull it toward you, the whole outside of the ball should be getting smoother.
Yeah, the top's getting smooth, the bottom's getting the creases.
Okay, that's fine. If that happens to you, just make the top of it, the crease, the seam side, that's going to be the top of your bread. When you put it in the proofing basket, put it seam side up.
Okay.
And you can actually pinch that seam together once you put it in the basket to put even more tension on the outside of your bread and kind of squish that seam together.
So Mike, that's my question. Can you see mine in the basket?
Yes.
What do I do with that?
You can just bring the outsides together. Here, I'll do it with mine so you can kind of see. Mine really doesn't need it, but you can just kind of pull it together, pinch it together, and form a little seam down the middle. Some bread makers really almost insist on doing that. I find if you get enough tension in the outside of your bread dough, you don't have to do it. But if you don't have a lot of tension, or if you've got a really messy bottom, you can simply just pull that together and form a seam that looks kind of like that. As the bread rises, that seam is going to smooth out, because as this dough is it's going to continue rising, getting bigger and bigger as we go into the next phase, and it's going to smooth out a lot as it goes through that process.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Does this mean there's too much flour if it's staying a little bit like lumpy on top?
It may, or it may be that you didn't need it, could use a little bit more kneading.
Okay.
I wouldn't worry about that too horribly much if it overall feels pretty smooth. You're gonna probably get a nice, beautiful loaf of bread out of it anyway.
Okay.
And let's see. So the very last stage, we'll just quickly finish making up these bagel shapes here. And then we'll show you what you need to do for your, I'm gonna show you something that's gonna come into play later. It's important for later, but I wanna do it before I finish setting up my bread because I want you to be able to see the dough. So the next phase of this is the most crucial part of the whole process, and it's called the proofing. And proofing is where the yeast and bacteria are digesting the wheat. They're taking the starches, turning them into proteins and vitamins and all kinds of wonderful stuff. But you can let it go too long. And so depending upon the strength of your starter, depending upon the temperature in your room, all kinds of variables is going to determine how long that process takes. And the very worst thing that you can do to a poor little loaf of sourdough bread is to let it proof too long. Proofing not long enough, not really that big of a problem. Proofing too long is disaster. And the way that you know how far along the process the proofing is that as it starts to rise, there's going to get to be more and more tension in the skin of your dough. And so you'll notice now, like there's a nice big bunch of texture and tension in this dough. So when I poke the skin of it with my finger just very lightly, we call this the poke test. It springs right back out. It resumes the shape it was in when I poke it. And you want that to happen. In the early stages, if you've got enough tension and everything's all set, it will return to its normal shape very, very quickly. As it rises, that's going to start slowing down as it gets further and further into the proofing process. How quickly it returns back to its shape is going to slow down. And you want to catch it before it gets too far. Eventually, if you've overproofed it, you're going to put a little dent in like that, and it's not going to come back. It's just that the little dent that I put in it will stay there forever. And that means it's overproofed. So periodically, we're going to take a break now. We're going to come back at around 3 o'clock. So from 10 until 3, it's going to go for about 5 hours of proofing for this next stage. And you're going to periodically want to check your dough and see if it's starting to proof too quickly, if it's rising up and that it's not coming back fast enough. You're going to want to put your bread in the refrigerator. You can literally, this stuff is wonderful. You can stick it in the refrigerator and let it proof overnight. It'll still proof. It'll just proof very, very slowly in the refrigerator. But we're going to do it on the counter for now. But if it starts, like if it's going too fast and the poke test isn't working out and it's not returning to its normal shape very quickly, you're going to want to put it in the refrigerator so that you don't have overproof bread when we meet back at 5 o'clock. And at 5 o'clock, we're going to put it in the oven and bake it.
Couple of things. Preparing the oven.
Yeah, but I'm not done with this yet.
Okay.
So to finish setting up your bread, because we don't want the bread to dry out, and it's going to be sitting here for 5 hours. So you're going to want to find a plastic bag. It can be anything. We reuse produce bags from the grocery store, any other plastic garbage bag, any kind of bag. I like to be able to see through the bag as best I can. And you're just going to take the plastic bag, you're going to wrap it around your proofing basket, tie the bottom up, and put it on the counter to let it sit. And then periodically when you check it, you can, lift the bag open and, do your poke test and check on it. It'll probably not change a lot in the first hour or so, but then all of a sudden you'll start seeing more and more rise. And probably when you come back at 3 o'clock, take a mental picture of this loaf of bread. This is going to be probably up over the top of this basket. It's going to be a lot bigger loaf of bread when we look at it the next time. And yours should be getting bigger and bigger too over the next 5 hours. And again, if it's getting big too fast and the poke test isn't working, get it in the refrigerator quickly, because there's nothing sadder than an overproof loaf of sourdough bread. It won't come back. When you handle it, it'll just collapse, sort of like a souffle. So, and then yeah, Diane, you have a question?
Was I supposed to flip the bread, like the tight top, put that in the bottom?
Yep.
Oh. Okay.
If you didn't, don't worry about it. The only reason to do that is an aesthetic thing. And depending upon, and it's not worth handling your bread again. The more you handle it at this point, the more air will come out of it. So from this point forward, as soon as the proofing starts, we want to handle our bread the least amount possible, because every time you touch it, every time you handle it is an opportunity to lose fluffiness in the bread. So if you didn't flip it, it's fine. The bottom of the proofing basket is going to smooth it out anyway.
Yep.
Then you had a thing you were going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say there's a couple of things to be ready when we come back, because we're going to be doing baking. And so you want to make sure to preheat your oven so that it's ready to go. The other thing is, and this is, another variable, depending on the humidity in your house and how your oven cooks. Our oven tends to cook slightly cooler than what the temperature says. Whether your oven is gas or whether it's electric, there's just so much variability in that. What we do is we take a tray, almost like a roasting tray that you put a turkey in. It's about a couple inches high, and we put water in the pan, maybe about a couple of inches of water, and then we slip that into the bottom of the oven, that metal roasting pan, and that's going to give us humidity inside our oven. That's just the particulars of our oven, because we want that humidity in there. And I fill the tray and I put it in the oven, obviously, before the oven gets started. And so that tray is going, and that humidity is going to heat as the oven heats. And that will help our bread along as well. If you're using a Dutch oven, sometimes we'll make our bread on one of these baking trays, a flat baking tray. That works great. But if you're using a Dutch oven, a pot, and we'll show you one of those. We've used those as well. You want to preheat that also. So as your oven is getting warm, you want to put that in there so that comes to temperature as well.
So yeah, the reason a lot of sites recommend using a Dutch oven is the Dutch oven keeps the moisture from the dough in the bread. And the more moisture it has while it's cooking will allow it to rise up. We're going to talk a little about scoring and egg washing and other things that help us get a bigger rise out of the bread. A Dutch oven is one of those things. Our bread tends to be bigger than will fit in one of these Dutch ovens. So, if you're thinking of using a Dutch oven, you might want to, get a really big Dutch oven. I recommend instead using the pan of water in the bottom of the oven and putting it on a large cookie sheet.
Yep.
But this is the other option. And if you're going to use a Dutch oven, you have to make sure it's certified to go into your oven at 500 degrees, Not all of them are. These ones that have rubber on them, some of them are only good to like 425 degrees. So you'll want to make sure it's good to go for 500 degrees. I recommend just use a cookie sheet, and use a nice big tray of water. That's going to keep enough humidity in the oven to keep the surface of your bread moist to get the maximum amount of rise out of it when it's baking.
Yeah. In a pinch, we've also used like a Pyrex baking dish, and that has worked as well. In addition,
but the 4 cups of flour bread is this is going to be a large loaf of bread, so a small Dutch oven isn't going to hold it probably. So there we go. Any questions about where? And we'll be meeting back again at 3 o'clock with our proofed bread, a warm oven, and hot water.
I have a question.
Sure.
The plastic around the basket, I'm gonna see if you can see mine. Is it tight or is it poofy?
it's poofy because your bread's gonna rise, Kim.
Okay.
And it also, the yeast and bacteria also needs to breathe a little bit, so you want as much air in there. The only purpose for it is to keep humidity in the bread. It's just to keep air from blowing on it and to keep the humidity in the bread.
Thank you.
You bet.
I have a question.
Okay.
So in my oven, I have a choice to bake the bread in the lower middle half or the upper middle half.
It's going to depend on your oven. You know, it really just is. As a general rule, the upper part of the oven is hotter, and bread likes to bake really, really hot. The hotter the oven is when you put the bread in, you're going to have what they call this rapid bloom. When you first put the bread in the oven, the hotter it is, the more rapid that bloom is going to be and the more beautiful your loaf of bread. So in general, the higher up in the oven it is, the hotter it will be and the more of a bloom you're going to get. But again, it depends on your specific oven. And
then also, what's your recommendation about a pizza stone versus a baking sheet?
You know, pizza stones can be wonderful. The thing about the pizza stones is that they get hot and stay hot, and so they can work. But given the fact that we're going to have a 500-degree oven and your baking sheet's going to be nice and 500 degrees no matter what, I don't think it makes that much difference.
Okay, thank you.
Anyway, well, if anybody has more questions, you can stick around. We'll be here for a few more minutes, and we'll see you back at 3 o'clock with proofed bread. And remember, do the poke test. You don't have to do it often. You don't want to poke your bread a ton, but if you see it getting big, poke test it. And if those dents are starting to stay in your bread, get it in the refrigerator right away, or you're going to have overproofed bread. And when we pour it out onto the cutting sheet, just score it and put the egg wash on. It's going to be very sad. It'll still be edible. It just won't be pretty.
Mike?
Yeah.
When do we start turning the oven on? Is that what we do at 3 o'clock?
I would do it, you know, it depends on how long it takes your oven to get preheated. It would just so that it's preheated when you get here at 3 o'clock. So if that's 10 minutes before, 5 minutes before.
Got it.
And again, set at 500 degrees. A nice hot oven.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And we're gonna have lovely bread later.
Woohoo! And rolls.
And bagels.
And bagels.
All right, thanks.
I have a quick question too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you gonna go over what you can do with the leftover starter?
Yes.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah, that's a great question.
We've got a whole list of things you can do.
The funnest thing you can do, I can just cover it right now. Are you familiar with English crumpets?
No, but I saw it on your website as a suggestion.
Okay, English crumpets are one of my most favorite things in the world. You know, traditionally they've been used for brunch. You can use them for breakfast. You can use them for lunch or dinner. They're really just like think of it like a cross between an English muffin and a pancake. Hang on just a quick second. I'll be right back. I'm gonna get a little fun.
They look a little bit like an English muffin.
Basically, to make a crumpet, you cook them on a griddle like you do a pancake. and you pour the dough or the starter just into these little muffin rings or egg rings. And you can make crumpets literally with just 100% sourdough starter. You will end up with a beautiful, fluffy, nice crumpet. But most people like to do a little tweaking of the starter. All you really have to do is take the starter, mix a teeny little bit of water, maybe a little bit of extra sugar, because some people like to sweeten them up a little bit. If the starter is really old, you may want to add a little bit of baking soda or baking flour, because the yeast will be dead and won't rise up. But if you've got a nice active leftover starter, it will be just all by itself with just a little bit of water and a little bit of sugar. It'll make a really beautiful batter, and you can just pour it into these rings. You cook it on a griddle on the lowest possible temperature. Unlike a pancake, you don't flip them. You just cook them on the griddle until the top is completely dry. And if the top is having a hard time drying, but the bottom is dry, you can take the rings off, put them in the oven at 350 degrees for a minute or two, and they literally make just the most lovely muffin type thing. You can make breakfast sandwiches out of them. You can use them for just about anything, and they're delicious, and they're really, really good for you.
Yeah, the crumpets as they're cooking will bubble, and so you'll get that texture almost like a sliced muffin, where it has bubbles and texture across the top. If you don't have the rings, you can take a can, and it's kind of hard to find these because a lot of times they have the shaped bottom on tin cans. But if you do find a can that you can cut off the top and bottom, you can make your own rings that way, and they work pretty well as well.
And some people just make unformed crumpets. They literally just spoon the batter out onto the griddle. I like to make them with the rings, because then to make a breakfast sandwich, I'll put the sausage, I'll put the egg, and you end up, with your homemade gourmet version of like an egg McMuffin. And, they just make the most perfect lunch and breakfast sandwiches. And you can make everything the same size by putting it in those rings.
Yep.
And do you take the starter right from the fridge, or do you need to leave it out so it warms up?
I will. I want the yeast to be active, and that's what's going to create the bubbles and the lightness in the crumpet. So I like to warm it up. And again, if it's kind of tired starter, I'll mix in even just a little bit of flour and let it warm up, so that you're starting to see some bubbling action in the dough, and then just use that as your base for your crumpets.
Yeah.
You can also just take it. I love sourdough tortillas, which are super easy to make. And again, you don't even need a detailed recipe. Just take a bunch of starter, add flour to it, and mix it up until it starts to get into a soft dough. And then you can just roll it flat, cook it. Once you roll it flat with a rolling pin, it's literally 60 seconds on one side, 30 seconds on the other, and you will have the most delicious tortillas you can imagine. And you can use them, and they freeze beautifully. So you never, just between those two things, you never have to throw your starter away. But there's all kinds of things you can do with the starter.
And we just roll them out to be a size that goes into this cast iron pan, and you just do your tortillas on the stove.
On a medium heat stove.
Yep. So that's another idea for using your starter. We never throw starter out because we always come up with something.
Yeah, very often we'll use a big ceramic bowl like this when we feed our starter. We'll put the cast-offs in the ceramic bowl, and then when we get a big batch of starter sitting there in the bowl, then it's time to make crumpets or tortillas or whatever else we want to do with it.
Yep, and they freeze great, so you don't have to eat all of it. It's just nice to have them in the freezer, pull them out, thaw them, and then just make them for breakfast, lunch, dinner, or a snack.
Yeah, Rick?
During this proofing 5 hours, does my house temperature matter at all?
It does. The warmer the house, the faster the bread will proof. The cooler the house, the slower it will proof. Generally, sourdough, culture likes to have at least 70 degrees. So if it's, if your house is too cool, you may want to find a warmer space in the house to put it. It also will depend on the bacteria in your house. Remember, you've harvested the yeast and bacteria that live in your house. And so whatever the temperature is that they're used to is probably going to be reasonably okay, but it will proof faster, the warmer it is.
I have a question about my Dutch oven.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's a picture of it. Is that going to be big enough for one loaf of bread, or is it going to be too small? I put the can in there for scale.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
right. It might be good. We'll just have to see. It will fit in there for sure. It's
Okay.
probably going to fill up the whole bottom, and the challenge might be in the end getting it out. We'll just kind of see.
Okay, because prior to today, I've always taken my dough and divided it before I shape it.
Yeah.
So now I'm just making one big loaf, so it's kind
Yeah.
of an experiment for me too. So
Yeah. Well, you're going to have a really big loaf of bread, and it's going to be really fun. And
okay, I'll give it a shot.
and if the worst comes to worst, if it ends up filling up the bottom of your Dutch oven, it's certainly not going to come and probably touch the top. So
Okay.
as long as you let it cool and get it out of there, you'll be good.
Yeah.
I
So,
love
like,
those cast
about
iron
corn-
Dutch, those cast iron Dutch ovens are lovely. I love
Yeah,
them.
we've got one Kim, that looks almost exactly like yours. And we've
Okay,
used
cool.
it. Yeah, we've used it. It's filled the bottom, but not come over the top.
All
Hey
right.
guys. Hi.
Do you guys
Hi.
recommend cornmeal across the bottom of it?
Oh, just if you wanted to sprinkle some flour in there, that would be great. We always like to flour the surface of whatever you're going to bake it on. So, and that works really good.
Yep.
Yeah, and Valerie had a question?
Yeah, mine is not ready. It's still sticky. So what should I do? Should I put, can you see this?
Yes. I would just add more, keep putting more flour in and kneading and add more flour and knead more.
Okay. All right, so it's not ruined. I was wondering, if it's ruined, but it's not ruined. I just keep adding flour.
Yep. Add flour and knead it some more.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you mute if you're not talking right now?
Yeah, I'll just mute everybody.
Oh, I have a question.
Okay, unmute yourself because I just muted everybody. So there we go.
I lost sound for a little while, so I didn't hear. Did you say to preheat the oven to 500 before 3 o'clock?
Correct.
And should the baking sheet be in the oven so that it's also preheated, or no?
No. Yeah,
Okay.
that's one of the other disadvantages of the Dutch oven, because if you're using a Dutch oven, you have to preheat it. That's the only way you get the benefit from the Dutch oven. And getting your dough into a very hot Dutch oven is a very tricky maneuver without burning yourself. And so there's a whole lot of reasons. I prefer the tray of water approach to keeping the humidity in your bread as it's rising. I mean, also, if you're baking one loaf of bread at a time, a Dutch oven can be serviceable. But as you get more and more into sourdough baking, you're going to realize that if you can do 3 or 4 loaves of bread because it freezes so well, your amount of labor per loaf goes way down if you can do a whole bunch of baking at one time. And then you're not going to have enough Dutch ovens or enough room in your oven for 4 or 5 Dutch ovens. And so the baking sheet, the big baking sheets are really, with the tray of water underneath, it really duplicates the benefit of the Dutch oven without any of the hassle. So, I really recommend, tray of water at the bottom of the oven and baking sheets.
And if we are baking multiple loaves, would you recommend we use the convection bake setting if we have that?
You can. We usually use the convection bake, especially like when we have like 2 or 3 trays. Like, so this is our bagels. Oh gosh, they're gonna look beautiful. look at our bagels. When you have multiples of these, to get them evenly browned across all of those bagels, the convection bake will really help spread the browning evenly across all of them. It's less important when you're doing a loaf of bread, but yeah, the convection bake is great.
And then do you do the temperature a little lower when you use your convection setting, or do you still
We
do
don't,
it?
but our oven is weird. Remember, our oven tends to cook really cool. And again, it's a very much it's a your oven kind of thing. Most people say 500 degrees for baking bread, but the reality is that it's mostly the hotter the better, and most ovens don't go much over 500, which is why they say 500. In the really olden days, when they did fire roasted, bread baking, they could get those ovens up to 700-800 degrees and bake bread in those. So, you can get it pretty hot. You don't have to worry about it being too hot.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Our house runs pretty cool. Would you ever put it on a radiator, or would that be too hot?
Well, you could. You have to make sure it's not too hot by putting some things in between. You're putting it near there. When we're having a particularly cool day in our house, we'll put it maybe near the stove if we're going to be cooking lunch, or doing it. We'll find the warmest spot in the house where we can, let the bread proof.
Okay.
All right, and we'll be around for another couple of minutes or so. We're looking forward to seeing your bread. Valerie, how is your dough doing? Oh, you're muted. Here, let me Here, I'll unmute. I'm sorry. How's your dough?
I think it's better.
Yay! Very good. Yeah, it does look better. Yeah. Now it looks better. So now if you can do the shaping and get it into your proofing basket, we'll be good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Get it into more of a ball.
And
Okay.
and then do that scraping to shape it, and then get it in your proofing basket. It's looking a lot better.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
I want to make, I actually made 2 batches, and I'm making a loaf, but I want to make rolls.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
What was the different step for making rolls? I still knead it and everything and then divide it, and then
Yes.
Yeah.
And then what I do is I roll it into like a long tube, because then all I do is I cut that tube to make each individual roll. And then once I cut them, I take each of those rolls and I roll them around in my hands to make a ball. So it's like a mini bread ball. And then on a cookie sheet with flour, put flour on a cookie sheet and then put them on the cookie sheet. And you want to spread them apart as much as you can because they're going to rise. And you don't want them squishing too much together.
Show her that one. And then you just put the whole tray. We're gonna put those bagels in we're gonna put our bagels in a plastic bag here soon too. Even the rolls, the bagels, they all get covered while they're proofing so that they keep the moisture in. And this tray has got the.
No, I just wanted to ask them because.
So if you can see these on here, this is what you're aiming for, and these are already starting to rise. They're bigger than when I even rolled them out. So the rising is going very quickly. The difference between the rolls and the bread is you're not going to be making the rolls at 500. The rolls will make it 450.
Okay. And do you have to get the skin on each individual? How do you get the skin on each individual roll?
You can scrape them. Just use that same technique. It's just smaller. You do the exact same thing with each roll. As you do with the bread.
Yep, it's just mini, teeny weeny bread.
Okay, I never felt really like my bread was too well to the cutting board, but That's why I made 2 to try it twice.
Okay,
Okay, great. Experimentation. We do that all the time.
And again, you're going to end up, each of those little things is a minor detail. They all come together beautifully. And if they don't, you're still going to end up with better bread than you can get at the store.
Yeah.
Hey,
And
well,
it's an art, not a science. Our ancestors have been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, think about this. These people, I love this story. Michael Pollan told it, he did a series on food, and one of them was on fermentation, and he did a whole thing on sourdough bread. And the speculation is that people developed sourdough bread because they were using flour. They were making unleavened bread, typically, and that somebody someday at some place just happened to leave the bread and the water together, and they noticed it was this bubbly thing, and they didn't want to throw it away, so they made it into bread. And nobody was measuring to any sort of precise measurements, and they made bread that way without the instruments that we have in our kitchens. Then they did it for thousands and thousands of years. So really, if you just have the bread and the water and the yeast and that culture started, you're gonna have good bread. Yep. And it really is that easy. Now, if you want to get really nuanced and detailed about texture, and you can learn your process and what you like in your bread. The nuances of how you do it you'll learn over time, and then you will have your own unique brand of sourdough, and it's going to be lovely. So you can't screw it up. It's a discovery process for making your own sourdough using your own starter and in your own environment. They all change everything.
Yeah, and you'll see a difference between baking now and baking in summer versus baking in the middle of winter. In Minnesota, the weather affects a lot.
And I just like to notice how much smoother and larger these bagels are already starting to get. You can start to see the tension and the smoothness. These were not as smooth as this, and they were not so these are, and the holes are starting to close up. So this dough is starting to rise already.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And we'll see you back at 3 o'clock.
Okay.
Okay, great.